This is Hannah. This is Bailey.
That's Butters.
Welcome to the Motocross Vlog.
Alright, let's do it again.
Hello, this is Tony Blazer, back with another video for the Motocross Vault on YouTube, and what I'm going to cover in this one is one of my favorite motorcycles of the 1990s, the 1995 YZ250. This is a machine I actually owned, really enjoyed it, great machine, wasn't perfect, but certainly one of the better Yamahas of the decade, by many accounts the best machine of 1995, although you probably have some debates now. Most people think of the Hondas of this era as being omnipotent, but actually in most shootouts the Hondas actually didn't win. They had some serious suspension issues back at this time. They had really great motors, but they weren't necessarily always the best bike. Although if you look for restorations, probably mostly because of Jeremy McGrath, they're probably the most popular ones you're going to find now. A lot of people do 95 and 96 restorations, but this YZ in 1995 was coming on the third year of its body style. It was originally introduced in 1993. And I think in 95 they had a lot of the bugs worked out. Some things better. They took a few little steps back in some ways in terms of handling, made some choices that probably didn't work out. But overall, it was a really great machine, a bike I enjoyed, and certainly one of the iconic machines of the 90s with its crazy looks and over-the-top graphics. So if you like this sort of thing, check out my channel. I have a ton of bike reviews, including many other machines similar to this YZ from the 90s. If you like it, subscribe, ding the little bell, tell your friends, share it on social media, and I certainly hope you enjoy it. Here's the story of the 1995 Yamaha YZ250. As I said in the intro, the platform that the 95 YZ250 was based on was originally launched in 1993. Here's an ad with Damon Bradshaw for the all-new 93 YZs. This bike was really kind of a jack-of-all-trades. It was a good middle-of-the-road machine. The engine wasn't omnipotently powerful. It certainly wasn't as outright blisteringly fast as the Honda in 93, but it had a good wide power band. These early 90s Yamahas were known for their broad power, good solid, easy to use motor, hooked up really well. Wouldn't jerk your arms out of your sockets, but it was a great overall machine. The suspension wasn't as plush as the Kawasaki, but it was better than what you would have found on the Hondas. It didn't turn as well as the CR or the RM, but it also didn't head shake like they did. It was really kind of a great, do-it-all machine if you're looking for a bike that you could, race week in and week out without too many mods and not have to worry about, having the bars ripped out of your hands on a fifth gear straight. Now, in kind of this 93, 94 era, the one thing that people did complain about was the rear suspension had an issue where under acceleration it would drop down a little bit. The linkage curve they chose caused it to kind of settle down to the rear end a little bit under power. Companies like Nolene and DeVol made quite a bit of money in 93 and 94 making custom linkages that would prevent this from happening. But that was really kind of the only real complaint they have with these bikes. And if you added a long rod kit, which was an accessory kit that really boosted the torque of this motor, it was like a whole shot machine. In 94, these YZ250s, they were whole shotting almost every pro race. It's crazy. And Larry Ward ended up have some really fantastic finishes in this early 90s era on these essentially, modified stock YZ250s. They were great machines in 93 and 94 with a few simple mods. With an all-new bike on tap for 1996, there weren't a lot of huge chassis changes in store for the YZ250 in 1995. The basic frame was very similar to the year before, but they did make some changes in an effort to get a little better turning. As I'd said, this early 90s YZs were known for really middle-of-the-road handling. There wasn't the same kind of steering precision you got on a 93 CR250, but they weren't also going to head shake like crazy. So it was a trade-off most people liked. But for 95, Yamaha actually tried to get a little better response by moving the head pipe 10 millimeters forward. And they also decreased the offset and increased the trail by adding a new front set of clamps. And again, this was to try and get the bike to turn a little bit more like a Honda and have it a little bit more responsive at the front end. With the rear suspension, Yamaha chose not to redesign the linkage for 1995. Instead, they went with a couple of band-aids to try and reduce that droopy feeling under acceleration. In order to do that, they changed the shock slightly, added a slightly larger piston for 1995. They also changed the damping to have a little less high-speed compression damping and a little more low-speed compression damping. And again, that was to hope that they would keep the shock a little bit up in its travel under power. The top shock mount was also replaced with a Teflon bushing, and that was to address an issue some people had where the shock got kind of a clapped out feel because the top mount was getting a little bit of play, and it gave it kind of that clackety thing that I think anybody who has an older Honda is familiar with. On the fork side of things, there weren't really any major changes for 1995. The 1994 fork had been pretty well liked. The only complaint had been some mid-stroke harshness some people had complained about. So for 95, what they did was they added a mid-valve, which is something they had used in the work-style forks. What that was designed to do was help hold the fork up in repetitive bumps. So if you're hitting a bunch of bumps consecutively, you sometimes could get like a hydraulic lock or something in the fork. And that mid-valve is designed to kind of smooth that action out so you didn't get that harsh kind of spike midway through the travel. Now the spring and rebound damping rates were the same as 1994, but the fork's compression damping was decreased slightly because the mid-valve slowed the stroke somewhat as it went through the travel. So that was basically designed to work together to give a little smoother action overall for 1995. Of all the changes made in 1995 on the YZ250, by far the largest were in the motor department. This was kind of the first major revision the YZ250 had seen since 1982, when they came out with the YVPS, the Yamaha power valve system. This kind of drum style power valve had been in use since 82 with very few changes other than obviously than porting and stuff from year to year, but this was kind of the first major redesign for 1995. And what they did was they added an exhaust resonance chamber, an EGR valve, exhaust gas resonance chamber is what Yamaha called it. Basically it was what Honda had been using with their ATAC, the ATAC system in the early 80s. Kawasaki was the first manufacturer to kind of integrate this variable exhaust valve with the exhaust resonance chamber with the first KIP system. And in the 90s here, all the other manufacturers kind of went to this same design where it kind of combined those two technologies. And for 95, Yamaha added a little exhaust valve resonance chamber here off the side of the cylinder. And what that little chamber was designed to do was trick the motor into thinking it had a longer head pipe. You're going to give it essentially a torque pipe and a high RPM pipe all in one. It would low RPMs, it opens this little resonator valve off the side of the cylinder, and then at the higher RPMs the centrifugal ball governor closes that off to give a straight shot to the exhaust pipe. So in addition to adding the resonance chamber, Yamaha changed the porting slightly. They changed it to have a little bit different port angle. They also made the transfer port angle was a little shallower to improve fuel velocity for 95. The power valve governor also received a different opening rate for 1995, and it started at 5,900 RPMs and then opened fully at 68. And actually, that was a little bit later than it was in 1994. There was also an all-new carburetor for 1995. They ditched the long-used McCuney in favor of a Kaheen PKW. And this was done to increase the throttle response. They also changed the intake track slightly and also added a little stuffer for the reed separator, which was a trick that Honda was using at the time as well. The CDI was changed slightly for 1995 as well. They added the updated the voltage to give a little bit 25% more charge. And the crankcase inertia was also changed. It was been reduced 7% for 1995, and that was done to give it a little bit snappier response. All told, it was not a complete redesign of the motor, but it was by far the biggest changes that had been done to the YZ250 power plant in well over a decade. On the track, all these changes added up to one of the best machines available in 1995. The new motor had a very hooked up feel. It wasn't as blisteringly fast as the Honda, so if you had absolute traction, the CR would pull ahead, and it didn't have that hard mid-range punch that the KX offered, but what it did have was a smooth, long, strong power band. The new EGR valve and lighter crank and revised exhaust porting gave it a really wide power band. Like I said, I had this bike myself personally. It was a really electric feel. There was no really strong explosive hit or anything, but the bike just hooked up and pulled. It would hook up on really snotty terrain. If it was like a slick day, the YZ was probably the best bike for that. If there was like deep loam or sand or something, obviously a machine like the Honda was probably had an advantage in terms of power, but it was a very, very competitive machine, and depending on the conditions, could or could not be the best motor. Really, the only problems with the motor were really two. The shifting continued to be pretty notchy. These YZs going back even to the 80s always had kind of a notchy feel to them. It wasn't as terrible as like the 125s in the 80s. I had a couple of those and they just would not shift under power. So it wasn't quite that bad, but it certainly wasn't slick shifting in the way like a Suzuki or a Honda was at the time. The bike also actually had a problem too, where if you ran pump gas, it would ping a little bit. It was always best to put a little bit of race gas in there, put an octane booster or something in it, because you could you definitely hear knocking. If you got it in sand or put the motor under heavy load, it would knock a little bit. But in stock condition, it was extremely competitive. The suspension was very, very good as well. The kind of band-aid fixes they had done in the rear shock did work pretty well. There was less of that drooping. You had to run, less, maybe 10 millimeters less preload than you normally would, or less sag, I'm sure, than you normally would. You had to run a lot of preload on the shock to kind of keep the rear end up, and the damping changes definitely did help in that regard. The suspension front and rear was excellent for pretty much anybody below the pro class. If you were going to like take it onto a supercross track or try and do some really big jumps, or if you're particularly heavy, I'm over 200 pounds, so even when I was riding in the 90s, I was still, I don't know, probably 180, 190 then. And if you came up a little short, or you really sky shot the thing, it would bottom out. But for most track conditions, it worked very well. Some people had a beef a little bit with the bottoming system on these forks, and that when they did bottom, they had kind of a harsh feel to them, but the mid-stroke harshness was less for 1995. And as long as you weren't like, super fast Jeremy McGrath type or somebody, you'll probably be real happy with the stock suspension. Now, the one area where the bike probably did take a step back in 1995 was in handling. The changes they made it to the front end actually ended up giving the bike head shake for the first time in forever. Yamahas are always known for their super good stability, and these changes to put a little more weight on the front end didn't really make a huge difference in terms of turning. It was still kind of a middle-of-the-road handler in that respect, but now it actually had head shake. So by most people's count, it was actually a step back for 1995, because the bike wasn't hugely better turning, but it was appreciably less stable. So kind of a trade-off there that most people didn't think was probably worth it. But overall, an excellent machine to be sure. Now, one thing that is worth mentioning here is the styling on the bike. This is kind of the last year for the kind of crazy 90s look. I actually liked it in 1995. I wasn't a real big fan of the 94 look with the lavender and lightning bolts, and this still had like a purple frame. You'll notice here Jeff Emmig's bike is completely different looking. It has a dark blue bodywork that would end up being basically the standard look for 96 in going forward when they switched to the blue. So they debuted this blue look in 1995 on the factory Yamahas. I didn't actually like it that year. I much preferred the look of the stock bike. Of course, I think most people would probably call that blasphemy now, but even though objectively a purple frame is a strange choice, for some reason these appeal to me more than some of the others. Something about the color combo is really cool. The purple seat and stuff. It's funny in general, I don't really like a lot of the 90s bikes. I think, some of the 95 Purple CR, for some reason, I didn't care for. So it's kind of hypocritical maybe, but for some reason, this one did it for me. It didn't make my top 10 list of the best looking Yamahas. I was actually debating it, even though I think, I'm not sure how many people actually would agree with that. This bodywork in general, I don't think is probably nearly as attractive as the 96 and later, but something about the overall look of this one model, the 95, does it for me in a way that the 93 and the 94 didn't. But in general, I really love this bike. It was not a perfect machine. Like I said, it maybe didn't handle as well as the CR. I had a 96 CR, and it certainly wasn't as fast as that motorcycle. But the stock suspension was better. Certainly at my pace, it was better. The bike itself was very competitive. An excellent machine. Motocross Action picked it as the bike of the year in 1995. Really good machine, and actually in most ways way better than the 1996 YZ, which was all new the year later, but way worse in pretty much every category. They somehow screwed up the power in 96. The suspension was all jacked up. I think the basic platform was better. The ergonomics were certainly better. bike handle better. There was a lot of things that they did do right in 96, but it would take them a couple years to get it sorted out, as well as this 1995 model was. I think Yamaha really went out with a bang here in 95 with a very, very good, very competitive machine that a lot of people really like and still think fondly of now. I would love to pick up one of these and redo it. It's definitely a cool machine that I wish I still had in my garage. If you'd like to check out some of these other tests I've done a lot of other classic bike reviews and looking at machines from the CR80 to the ATC 250R to the history of the XR 250, all kinds of stuff. Basically covering classic motorcycles, classic moto. You can check out on my channel. I also have written several more of these, including a write-up on this 1995 YZ250, which I did way back in 2013. You can find it here at pulpmx.com, where I write for Steve Mathis on all things motocross. So give it a check if you'd like to read a little bit about moto. If you have any suggestions for some other motorcycles or videos you'd like to see, feel free to leave a comment in the comment section below, or you can always hit me up on Instagram and Twitter. I definitely respond to my DMs. The address there is at Tony Blazer. That's TonyBlazer. And until we meet again, keep the rubber side down, and peace.